Houston, mid-2010s, in the city's largest amusement park, surrounded by the joyful screams of thousands of children. A darker sound was being hidden in plain sight. When a 10-year-old girl vanished near the clown stage, her mother, haunted by a past tragedy, refused to accept the official story. Her lonely, desperate search would lead her into a secret world beneath the park, exposing a horrifying truth that used the park's own magic as the perfect camouflage. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. Now let me tell you the story. For Denise Carter, the annual trip to Houston's sprawling Astro World amusement park was an exercise in controlled, hyper-vigilant joy. At 38, she was a woman who understood the world in terms of risk assessment, a skill honed by her years as a sharp, methodical paralegal, and more profoundly, by the ghost that had haunted her family for over a decade. Her younger sister had vanished at 17, a cold case filed away in a dusty police archive, a story without an ending that had left Denise with a permanent, low-grade hum of anxiety. This history had transformed her from a typical, loving mother into a fierce, almost painfully protective guardian of her 10-year-old daughter, Kayla. But on this bright, sun-drenched Saturday in the heart of the Texas summer, Denise was determined to let the joy win. Kayla lived for this day. It was a rare, precious escape from their quiet, routine life, a full-throated immersion into a world of pure, chaotic magic. Denise watched her daughter, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated bliss, as she rode the carousel for the third time, and felt the tight knot of her own anxiety loosen, just a little. For today, in this place of manufactured happiness, she would try to believe they were safe. The park was a symphony of overwhelming sensation, the roar of the roller coasters, the cheerful mechanical music of the rides, the sticky sweet smell of cotton candy, and the constant joyful screams of 1,000 children all blended into a single, overwhelming wave of sensory input. It was a place designed to overwhelm, to distract, to immerse its visitors in a state of pure, unthinking fun. Denise held Kayla's hand in a grip that was just a little too tight as they navigated the crowded thoroughfares. She was a woman who noticed things. She saw the details that the happy, distracted crowds overlooked. The security guard who seemed to be texting instead of watching, the overflowing trash can, the subtle, almost imperceptible cracks in the park's perfect, happy facade. Her sister's disappearance had taught her a hard, bitter lesson. The world was not a safe place, and danger often wore the mask of the ordinary, but she could not deny the magic of the day. She saw it reflected in her daughter's wide, shining eyes. Kayla, a quiet, imaginative girl who had inherited her mother's observant nature, was in her element. She loved the chaos, the color, the sheer, overwhelming spectacle of it all. They spent the morning on the gentler rides, the afternoon winning a cheap, oversized stuffed animal at a ring toss game, and as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the park, they made their way to Kayla's favorite spot, the Grand Plaza near the main arcade. This was the heart of the park's chaotic, joyful energy. It was a place of a constant, swirling motion, a crossroads where the paths from a half-dozen different themed sections of the park converged. And it was the stage for the park's most beloved and most iconic performers, the Astro World Clowns. They were a troupe of a half-dozen brightly colored, larger-than-life figures, their painted smiles a permanent fixture of manufactured joy. They juggled, they made balloon animals, they performed slapstick routines that sent waves of delighted laughter through the crowds of children who gathered to watch them. Kayla was mesmerized. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes fixed on the lead clown, a tall, lanky figure with a bright orange wig and a perpetually surprised expression painted on his face. His name, according to the park's program, was Mr. Patches. He was a master of his craft, his movements a fluid, comedic ballet. Denise watched her daughter, and for a single, beautiful, and ultimately heartbreaking moment, she forgot to be afraid. She saw only the pure, innocent joy on her child's face, and in that moment of distraction, in that brief, fatal lapse of her own hyper-vigilant guard, Her world was about to be shattered. The clown performance was the grand finale to their perfect day. Kayla stood at the very front of the crowd of children, her head tilted back, her face a perfect portrait of pure, unadulterated awe. She was completely captivated by the magic, by the sheer, overwhelming spectacle of the clown's chaotic, colorful world. Denise stood a few feet behind her, a fond, weary smile on her own face, her gaze drifting for a moment to the map in her hands, planning their route to the exit. It happened in a matter of seconds. A silent, almost invisible tear in the fabric of the happy, noisy scene. The lead clown, the tall, lanky figure known as Mr. Patches, was in the middle of a juggling routine. His brightly colored balls, a mesmerizing blur in the air. As the routine reached its crescendo, he seemed to stumble, dropping one of the balls. It rolled, as if by accident, to the edge of the performance area, stopping just a few feet from where Kayla was standing. Mr. Patches, in a piece of classic slapstick comedy, made a great theatrical show of being unable to retrieve the ball. He would reach for it, and then stumble backward. He would try again, and then get tangled in his own comically oversized feet. The children in the crowd shrieked with laughter, and then he looked directly at Kayla. He gave her a big, friendly, and conspiratorial wink, and he gestured with his head, a small, subtle, and almost imperceptible nod towards the dropped ball, and then towards a small, seemingly private, curtained-off archway at the back of the performance stage. It was an invitation, a silent, playful request for a small, adoring fan to become a part of the show, to help the silly, clumsy clown retrieve his lost prop. For a 10-year-old girl who was completely and innocently captivated by the magic of the moment, it was an irresistible call to adventure. She looked back at her mother, but Denise's head was still bent over the map. Kayla saw her chance. This was her moment to be a hero, to be a part of the magic. With a look of pure, excited determination on her face, she slipped away from the edge of the crowd, picked up the fallen ball, and, with a final, triumphant glance at the winking clown, she disappeared behind the curtained archway. Denise looked up from her map, a full 10 seconds having passed. Her eyes scanned the front of the crowd, searching for Kayla's bright yellow t-shirt. It wasn't there. A small, cold flicker of panic, the familiar, unwelcome hum of her old anxiety, started in her chest. She pushed her way through the crowd of parents, her eyes darting back and forth. "Kayla?" she called out, her voice still quiet, still controlled. "Kayla, honey, where are you?" The clown show was ending. The clowns were taking their final, exaggerated bows. The cheerful, mechanical music was reaching its final, tinny crescendo. The crowd of children began to disperse, a happy, chattering wave of humanity that was now an obstacle, a wall between her and her own, suddenly, terrifyingly absent child. The flicker of panic was now a full-blown, roaring fire. Kayla was gone. The initial, frantic moments of the search were a blur of a pure, adrenaline-fueled terror. Denise pushed through the dispersing crowd, her head on a swivel, her voice a sharp, high-pitched cry of her daughter's name. She checked the arcade, the bathrooms, the souvenir shop. Nothing. It was as if Kayla had simply and silently evaporated into the thick, happy, and suddenly, horrifyingly indifferent air of the amusement park. She ran to the nearest park security officer, a young man with a bored, disinterested expression, and the words tumbled out of her mouth, a frantic, incoherent torrent of a mother's worst nightmare. "My daughter, she's gone. She was right here, at the clown show. A clown, he gestured to her. The young officer's expression shifted from boredom to a kind of practiced, professional calm. He got on his radio, his voice a low, dispassionate monotone. "We have a possible code, Adam. 10-year-old female. Last seen at the main plaza stage. The park's lost child protocol, a well-oiled and frequently used machine, clicked into gear." But for Denise, it was a slow, torturous, and maddeningly inadequate response. She was met by the park's head of security, a man in his late 50s named Chief Miller, a former cop with a weary, cynical face and an air of a man who had seen it all and was impressed by none of it. Denise, her voice trembling but firm, recounted the story. She told him about the clown, about the dropped ball, about the subtle, almost invisible gesture. She was a paralegal, a woman trained to observe and to report facts, and these, she insisted, were the facts. Chief Miller listened, a look of polite and deeply patronizing patience on his face. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a slow, placating drawl, "I understand you're upset, but our performers have a very strict no-contact policy. They do not approach the children. They do not interact with them directly. It's for everyone's safety. It's possible that in all the excitement, you might have misinterpreted what you saw." "I know what I saw," Denise insisted, her voice rising, a mixture of a desperate frustration and a hot white rage. He gestured to her. "And she's gone." "We'll check the security cameras," Miller said, the words a hollow procedural promise. He made a call on his radio. A few agonizing minutes later, the answer came back, an answer that was so convenient, so perfect in its timing, that it was a lie that was almost breathtakingly audacious. "Chief, we have a problem," the voice on the radio crackled. "The camera covering the main stage, it's down. Looks like it's been on the fritz all afternoon. A power surge maybe, a camera malfunction, a strict no-contact policy, a mother who was emotional and therefore unreliable. The official narrative was being constructed right there in front of her. A narrative that was designed not to find her daughter, but to protect the park, to manage the liability, to contain the situation. The wall of excuses was being built, brick by brick. A wall that was designed to obscure the terrible, simple, and monstrous truth. A wall of corporate and deeply, soul-crushingly indifferent procedure. Denise Carter was not just fighting to find her daughter. She was fighting a system that had already decided, for its own selfish and deeply cynical reasons, that her daughter was not a victim to be found, but a problem to be managed. The arrival of the Houston Police Department did little to break down the wall of institutional indifference. The case was assigned to Detective Riley, a jaded, overworked cop from the Missing Persons Unit, a man for whom a missing child at an amusement park was a depressingly familiar, and almost always, very simple story. He arrived at the park's small, sterile security office to a scene that confirmed all of his most cynical, professional expectations. He saw a distraught, and in his assessment, a slightly hysterical mother. And he saw a calm, professional, and very reassuring head of park security, Chief Miller, who had already, and very conveniently, packaged the entire incident into a neat, tidy, and low-priority narrative. "We have a lost child, Detective," Miller began, his voice a low, authoritative rumble. "The mother is, understandably, very upset. We've initiated our standard protocol. We have teams sweeping the park. 9 times out of 10, we find them in the arcade or asleep under a bench in a couple of hours." Detective Riley nodded, his own expression one of a weary, professional solidarity. He was a man who understood and respected the chain of command. The park was Miller's turf. He was the expert on the ground. Denise, who was sitting in a hard, plastic chair in the corner of the office, her body trembling with a mixture of a grief and a rage so profound it was a physical sickness, could not stay silent. "She is not a lost child," she said, her voice a low, fierce, and incredibly controlled whisper that was far more powerful than a scream. "She was taken. I saw it. I saw the clown gesture to her. And your camera, the one that would prove I'm right, just happened to be broken. How is that possible?" Riley looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not a hint of a curiosity or a concern. She saw only a tired and deeply patronizing pity. He saw a grieving mother who was, in her trauma, creating a wild and very unhelpful conspiracy theory. He turned his attention back to Miller. "You have any reason to suspect a parental abduction?" he asked. The question a standard, but in this case, a deeply insulting one. "Any custody issues with the father?" "I'm a single mother," Denise shot back before Miller could answer. "Her father hasn't been in the picture for years. This is not a custody dispute. This is a kidnapping." Riley sighed, a long, tired exhalation of breath. The case was now, in his mind, complete. It had all the familiar, messy hallmarks of a domestic issue. A single mother, an absent father. A child who had, in all likelihood, either wandered off and was now hiding, or had been taken by a relative in a sad, and ultimately, very common, family drama. He went through the motions. He took Denise's statement, his pen scratching out the key, and in his mind, the highly improbable details. The clown, the dropped ball, the secret gesture. He took a picture of Kayla from Denise's wallet. He assured her, in a flat, monotone voice, that they would do everything they can. But Denise knew, with a mother's absolute and heartbreaking certainty, that they would not. She had seen the look in his eyes. She had heard the dismissive tone in his voice. She was not a credible witness to a horrific crime. She was a hysterical mother, a potential domestic problem, a nuisance to be managed. The system had not just failed to listen to her, it had actively and deliberately chosen to disbelieve her. And in doing so, it had given the real monster, the one with the painted smile and the brightly colored costume, the one thing he needed most: time. While the world of official procedure was busy constructing a narrative of a lost child and a hysterical mother, another, far more sinister and far more efficient operation was unfolding in the secret, hidden spaces beneath the park. The network was a ghost, a perfectly designed and terrifyingly successful criminal enterprise that had turned the amusement park's own joyful chaos into its perfect and most impenetrable camouflage. They were not a gang. They were a corporation. Their business was human trafficking. Their product was children. And the Astroworld amusement park was their hunting ground, their processing center, and their main logistical hub. Their genius was in their simplicity. They had understood that in a place of such overwhelming sensory input, a place where thousands of children were a constant, swirling, and often unsupervised presence, a single, quiet, and well-executed abduction would be almost invisible. The clowns were the key. They were the perfect human camouflage. They were figures of such pure, unadulterated, and innocent joy that they were, in the eyes of both the children and their parents, beyond suspicion. They were a part of the magic, a part of the show. And this universal, unquestioning trust was the weapon they wielded with a chilling, professional precision. The operation was a masterpiece of logistics. The clowns, who were a third-party entertainment company under contract with the park, were the gatherers. They would identify a target, usually a child who was momentarily separated from their parents, and with a simple, playful gesture, a wink, a nod, an invitation to be a part of the show, they would lure them away from the crowd and behind the curtain of their stage. Behind that curtain was not a dressing room, but a doorway that led to the park's vast and largely forgotten network of underground maintenance tunnels. These tunnels, which had been built in the 70s to allow park staff to move, unseen, between the different sections of the park, were a secret, subterranean highway. Once a child was in the tunnels, they were in a different world, a world of darkness, of silence, and of a swift and terrifying efficiency. They would be moved quickly, through the dark, concrete corridors, to a central, hidden holding area, a makeshift, soundproofed prison that had been built in an abandoned section of the tunnels, directly beneath the main plaza arcade. Here, they would be held, sometimes for a few hours, sometimes for a day, until they could be moved, under the cover of darkness, out of the park itself. The tunnels connected, through a series of secret, unmapped exits, to the city's storm drain system, which in turn led to a series of off-site, anonymous locations, abandoned warehouses, empty, suburban homes. The invisible highway did not just run under the park. It ran under the entire city. The network's evil was not chaotic or passionate. It was a cold, pragmatic, and terrifyingly successful business model. It was a monster that had made its lair in the heart of a place of joy, a parasite that was feeding on the park's own manufactured happiness and on a system's willful and very convenient blindness. It was an invisible highway, a secret, subterranean river of sorrow, and its existence was a truth that was so monstrous, so unbelievable, that the world above had simply and collectively decided it could not possibly be real. Arthur Wynne, the man behind the painted smile of Mr. Patches, was a master of the double life. In the chaotic, immediate aftermath of Kayla Carter's disappearance, he was the picture of a concerned and deeply helpful employee. He was the one who calmly and methodically recounted the events of his performance to a grateful and very relieved Chief Miller. He sat in the park's small, sterile security office, his brightly colored clown costume now a jarring, almost grotesque counterpoint to the grim, serious atmosphere of the room. He had not yet removed his makeup, and his painted-on, perpetually surprised expression was a mask that was as perfect and as impenetrable as his own sociopathic soul. "It was just a normal show," he said, his voice a soft, slightly sad, and incredibly convincing instrument of deception. "A big crowd today, lots of happy kids. I was in the middle of my juggling routine, and I might have seen the little girl you're talking about. A yellow t-shirt, you said?" "Yes, I think I remember her. She was right at the front, smiling. A real sweet-looking kid. He was a brilliant performer. He was giving them exactly what they wanted to hear. He was confirming that Kayla had been there. He was painting a picture of a happy, ordinary scene. And he was, with a subtle and very clever genius, reinforcing the park's own preferred narrative." "The mother said you gestured to her?" Chief Miller asked, the question a soft, almost apologetic one. Arthur Wynn's painted-on, surprised eyebrows seemed to arch even higher. He let out a small, sad, and deeply wounded-sounding laugh. "Chief, you know our policy. We never, ever make direct personal contact with the children. We're there to entertain the crowd, not to single out individuals. The mother, she must be very upset. I can't imagine what she's going through. It's easy to get confused in a situation like this." He had, in a few, simple and beautifully executed sentences, completely and utterly discredited the one, single witness who had seen the truth. He had painted Denise Carter as a hysterical, and therefore unreliable narrator, and he had positioned himself as a sympathetic and very credible witness. He offered to help in any way he could. He gave them his contact information. He expressed his deepest and most sincere hope that the little girl would be found safe and sound. He was a pillar of the community, a man who loved children, a man who had dedicated his life to making them happy. He was the last person in the world anyone would ever suspect. When he was done with his statement, he walked out of the security office and back into the park. He went to the employee locker room, and he slowly and methodically began to remove his costume, his makeup. The friendly, magical, and beloved figure of Mr. Patches dissolved in a smear of grease paint and cold cream, revealing the cold, empty, and utterly monstrously ordinary face of Arthur Wynn. He was a predator who had just successfully, and very publicly, established his own perfect alibi. He had been a witness to the chaos, a concerned and very helpful witness. The wolf had not just put on a sheep's clothing, he had convinced the entire panicked flock that he was one of them. And now he was free to return to his den, to the secret, hidden world beneath their feet, to the new and very precious prize he had just so cleverly and so silently stolen. As the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the now empty amusement park, a new and very different kind of atmosphere settled over the place. The cheerful, mechanical music of the rides had been silenced. The joyful screams of the children had been replaced by the quiet, mournful chirping of crickets. The park, which had been a place of a vibrant, chaotic life just a few hours before, was now a ghost town, a vast and silent monument to a day that had started with a promise of joy and had ended in a nightmare. The official search had been a brief, and in Denise Carter's mind, a deeply, insultingly inadequate performance. The park security had done a cursory sweep of the grounds, their flashlights cutting lazy, indifferent arcs through the darkness. The Houston police had put out a bolo, a broadcast that had been swallowed by the vast and very busy airwaves of the city. And then, as the clock ticked past 10 p.m., the official world had decided that the day's work was done. Chief Miller, his face a mask of a weary and very final authority, had approached Denise where she sat, alone, silent, and very determined figure on a bench near the park's main entrance. "Ma'am, we've done all we can for tonight," he said, his voice a low and very clear dismissal. "The park is closing. You have to leave. The police will continue their investigation in the morning." Denise looked up at him. Her eyes, which had been a storm of a frantic and very raw emotion, were now a calm, cold, and incredibly dangerous-looking thing. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice a quiet and very firm declaration. "My daughter is in this park. I can feel it, and I am not leaving without her." It was a standoff, a quiet and very powerful battle of wills. Miller, a man who was used to his authority being unquestioned, was, for a moment, taken aback by the sheer, unshakable force of her conviction. But the park had rules, and the rules said that at closing time, everyone had to leave. "Ma'am, if you don't leave the premises, I will have to have you escorted out," he said, his voice now a hard and very final threat. In the end, she had no choice. She was alone, and in their eyes, a slightly unhinged woman against the full and very formidable weight of a corporate and a legal institution. She allowed them to walk her to the gate, her own small and very determined steps, a silent and very powerful protest. But she did not go home. She went to her car, which was parked in the vast and now almost empty parking lot. And she waited. She was a mother on a vigil, a warrior who had lost a battle, but who had no intention of surrendering the war. She knew, with a certainty that was so profound, so absolute, that it was a physical and very real thing in her gut, that her daughter had not been taken out of this park. She was still here, somewhere, hidden. She would spend the night in her car, her eyes fixed on the dark, and now very menacing silhouette of the amusement park. The place of her daughter's greatest joy had become the site of her own greatest and most terrifying battle. And it was a battle she was now, finally, and very terrifyingly, fighting all on her own. The silence of the empty amusement park was a special and a very exquisite kind of torture. The very things that had been the source of so much joy just a few short and now very long hours ago were now instruments of a profound and a very cruel psychological torment. Denise sat in her car, the engine off, the windows cracked just enough to let in the thick, humid, and very still night air, and she listened. She could hear the faint, ghostly echo of the carousel music, a cheerful, tinny, and now deeply menacing melody that the wind would occasionally carry across the vast, empty parking lot. The sound, which had been the soundtrack to her daughter's joyful, spinning laughter, was now a mocking and a deeply horrifying reminder of her absence. The park itself, a place of a bright and a very vibrant color, was now a world of a dark and a very menacing shadow. The roller coasters, which had been thrilling, soaring symbols of a carefree fun, were now skeletal, dinosaur-like creatures, their silent, motionless forms a stark and a very frightening silhouette against the star-filled Texas sky. The Ferris wheel, which had been a beautiful, spinning wheel of a light, was now a single, unblinking, and very red warning light at its peak, a lonely and a very ominous eye in the darkness. Her mind was a torture chamber of a memory and a fear. She would close her eyes, and she would see her daughter's smiling, joyful face, and then she would open them, and she would see the dark and the very empty park. The contrast was a physical and a very painful thing, a constant, rhythmic, and a very brutal reminder of what she had lost. She was a paralegal. Her mind was a trained and a very logical instrument. She tried to apply that logic to her situation. She tried to build a case in her own frantic mind. The clown, the gesture, the broken camera, the dismissive and the very convenient response of the park security. The pieces all fit together into a single and a very horrifying picture. A picture that no one else was willing to see. Was she going crazy? Was the trauma of her sister's disappearance, a wound that had never truly healed, now causing her to see conspiracies in the shadows? Was she, as Chief Miller and Detective Riley had so clearly and so condescendingly implied, just a hysterical and a very unreliable mother? The doubt was a poison, a small and a very insidious voice in the back of her mind. But then, she would remember the look on her daughter's face, the pure and the very innocent joy, the absolute and the very unwavering trust. And she knew that her daughter would not have wandered off. She would not have gone with a stranger. She had been lured. She had been taken. The agony of the carousel music, the menace of the silent dark rides, the poison of her own self-doubt, it was all a part of a new and a very terrible landscape of her own personal grief, a landscape that she would have to navigate all on her own, a landscape that was, in its own, strange and a very surreal way, just as frightening and just as disorienting as the amusement park itself. Back at the brightly lit and very busy headquarters of the Houston Police Department, the Kayla Carter case was already and very efficiently on its way to becoming a ghost. Detective Riley, after leaving the park, had returned to his desk, and with a weary and a very final sigh, he had typed up his official and very brief report. He had recorded the key, and in his mind, the most important facts. Mother, Denise Carter, single, and in his assessment, emotionally distraught. Father, absent, and as of yet, unidentified. Witness statements, none other than the mother's own, highly, and in his professional opinion, very questionable account of a clown. Park security, professional, cooperative, and with a very logical explanation for the camera malfunction. Conclusion, no evidence of foul play. He had then, with a single and a very final click of his mouse, assigned the case its official and its very damning classification: probable runaway divided by possible parental abduction. The classification was a bureaucratic and a very effective death sentence for any real and a very meaningful investigation. It moved the case from the high priority and the very urgent docket of the Violent Crimes Division to the low priority and the very slow-moving back burner of the Juvenile Division. It meant that there would be no citywide search, no massive and a very public media campaign. The case of Kayla Carter had, in the eyes of the system, been downgraded from a potential and a very horrifying crime to a sad and a very messy domestic issue. Riley did not see this as an act of a negligence. He saw it as an act of a professional and a very necessary triage. He was a man who was drowning in a sea of a violent and a very real crime. In the past 24 hours, he had been assigned 2 new homicides, a string of home invasions, and a brutal and a very public gang-related shooting. He had to focus his limited and his very valuable resources on the cases where there was a body, where there was a clear and a very present danger. A 10-year-old girl who had, in all likelihood, been picked up by her own estranged father in a sad and a very predictable custody battle was simply and very pragmatically not at the top of that list. He had seen the pain in Denise Carter's eyes, and he had, in a small and a very detached corner of his own weary heart, felt a flicker of a sympathy for her. But he had also seen what he believed to be the truth. A woman whose own past trauma was causing her to see a monster where there was, in all likelihood, just a sad and a very common family drama. He filed the report, he closed the file, and he moved on to the next, and in his mind, the more important tragedy. He was a good and a very competent detective. He was a man who believed in the system he served. He did not know, and he could not have known, that the system itself was the monster's greatest and most effective accomplice. The ghost of Kayla Carter had not just been created by a man in a clown costume. It had been created by a man in a police uniform, with a simple and a very final click of a mouse. Denise's lonely and very desperate vigil in the amusement park's parking lot was a testament to a mother's unshakable, and in the eyes of the world, a very irrational intuition. As the hours of the night bled into the first, pale, and a very gray light of the morning, a new and a very grim resolve had settled over her. If the police were not going to find her daughter, then she would have to do it herself. She knew, with a certainty that was a physical and a very real thing in her gut. that the answer to her daughter's disappearance was in the place where she had last been seen. The main plaza, near the arcade and the clown stage. She waited until the park's early morning. Maintenance crews began to arrive, their white unmarked vans a slow and a very steady trickle through the main gate. And in a moment of a pure and a very brazen audacity, she had simply and very confidently driven her own nondescript sedan in with them, her face a mask of a weary and a very bored authority, as if she were just another, very tired, employee, reporting for a very early shift. She had parked her car in a deserted and a very remote corner of the employee parking lot, and she had slipped, a silent and a very determined ghost, back into the park. The park, in the early morning light, was a strange and a very surreal place. It was a world of a silence and a very eerie stillness, the cheerful and the very colorful facades of the rides now looking like the painted and the very sad faces of a dead and a very forgotten carnival. She made her way to the main plaza. It was empty, a vast and a very silent concrete expanse, and she began her own and a very methodical investigation. She was a paralegal. She was trained to find the small and the very overlooked detail. She was on her hands and her knees near the clown stage, her eyes scanning the ground for anything, a dropped piece of a clothing, a scuff mark, any small and a very physical sign of a struggle, when she heard the voice. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice was a low and a very gravelly rasp. She looked up, and she saw a man. He was old, in his late 60s, his face a crumpled and a very weary road map of a long and a very hard life. He was wearing the simple and the very gray uniform of the park's maintenance staff. His name, according to the small and the very faded patch on his shirt, was Carl. "My daughter," Denise began, her own voice a raw and a very pleading whisper. "She disappeared from right here. Yesterday. The police, they're not looking." Carl Simmons looked at her, and in his eyes, she did not see the pity or the condescension she had seen in the eyes of Chief Miller and a Detective Riley. She saw something else, a flicker of a recognition, a spark of a shared and a very quiet suspicion. He was a man who had worked in this park for over 30 years. He was a man who, like her, noticed things. He had been on the verge of his own and a very quiet retirement. He had long ago stopped filing the reports. No one ever listened. But he had heard the noises, the strange and the very rhythmic banging sounds that would sometimes, in the dead and the very quiet hours of the night, seem to come from under the floor of the main arcade. He had been told, for years, that it was the old and the very loud pipes, that it was the ventilation system, that it was the rats, the clowns, Denise said, her voice a low and a very intense whisper. "I saw one of them." He gestured to her. He took her, and in that moment, Carl Simmons, the quiet and the very cynical old maintenance worker, the man who had long ago given up on the idea of the anyone listening, made a decision. He looked at the desperate and the very determined mother in front of him, and he believed her. He was her first and her most important and her most unlikely ally. The alliance between the grieving and the very determined mother and the cynical and the very weary old maintenance worker was a quiet and a very powerful thing. Carl Simmons was a man who knew the park's secret and its very hidden anatomy better than anyone. He was a man who had the keys. He led Denise away from the main plaza and away from the prying and the very watchful eyes of the other early morning maintenance crews. He took her to the back of the main arcade, to a cluttered and a very dusty storage area, a place that smelled of a stale popcorn and a very old grease. "You wait here," he said, his voice a low and a very conspiratorial whisper. "Wait until the park is quiet again. After the morning maintenance shift leaves, and before the park, officially, opens, there's a small and a very quiet window of a time. About an hour. Denise waited, her own, and a very frantic heart, a wild and a very loud drum in the quiet and the very dusty room. The hour of awaiting was a long and a very slow eternity of a pure and a very unadulterated terror and a hope. Carl returned, his own, and a very grim face, a mask of a quiet and a very determined resolve. "Okay," he whispered. "It's quiet now. Let's go." He led her back out into the main plaza. The park was now, once again, a silent and a very empty ghost town. The sun was higher in the sky, but the place still felt like a world of a shadow and a very deep secret. He took her to the exact spot where she had last seen Kayla, at the edge of the clown stage. "This is where I hear it," he said, his voice a low and a very soft rumble. "At night, when the machines are all off, a sound, a banging sound, from under the floor." They both stood there, in the profound and the very absolute silence of the empty park, and they listened. At first, there was nothing, only the sound of their own, and a very ragged breathing, and the distant, and a very mournful cry of a seagull. And then, they heard it. It was faint. It was rhythmic. And it was, unmistakably, and a very, very metallic. Bang, bang, bang. It was the sound of a metal on a metal, a sound that was coming from directly and a very clearly beneath their feet. It was a sound that was not the pipes. It was a sound that was not the ventilation. It was a sound that was a signal. It was the sound of a person. It was the sound of a hope. A small and a very faint and a very, very beautiful sound of a hope. The sound was a spark in the darkness, a confirmation of a truth that Denise had felt in her bones and Carl had suspected in his gut. It was real. It was here, beneath their feet. Carl's professional and a very weary cynicism was instantly and a very completely replaced by a surge of a pure and a very righteous adrenaline. He was a maintenance worker. He knew this park, and he knew that there was no official and a very documented piece of a machinery or a plumbing under this specific section of the main plaza. "The prize crates," he said, his voice a low and a very urgent whisper, his eyes locking onto a large and a very tall stack of a brightly colored and a very cheap cardboard boxes at the back of the arcade near the stage. "They're always there. They never move them. Even when they clean." It was a detail that was so mundane and so ordinary that it had become invisible, a permanent and a very unremarkable feature of the park's landscape. They moved with a new and a very shared sense of a purpose. They were no longer a grieving mother and a tired old worker. They were a team, an investigative team. They went to the stack of crates. They were heavier than they looked, filled with the cheap and the very pathetic stuffed animals that were the prizes for the arcade games. They began to move them, one by one, their movements a quiet and a very frantic dance in the silent and the very empty arcade. And as they removed the final and the very last crate, they saw it. It was not a part of the smooth and the very unbroken concrete floor of the main plaza. It was a square and a very distinct outline of a heavy and a very industrial steel. It was a maintenance hatch, a hatch that was not on any of the park's public or its very official maps, a hatch that had been deliberately and a very cleverly hidden in plain sight. The banging sound was louder here, clearer. It was coming from directly and a very unmistakably beneath the heavy and the very steel hatch. Carl knelt down, his own and a very old hands, the hands of a man who knew the park's secret and its very hidden anatomy, tracing the edge of the hatch. He saw the lock. It was not a standard and a very MTA issue lock. It was a heavy and a very industrial padlock, a thing that was designed to keep people out. Or, Denise realized with a new and a very cold wave of a terror to keep people in. Carl went to his tool belt. He was a man who had a key for every single and a very official lock in the park. But he did not have a key for this one. He took out a heavy and a very steel crowbar. "Stand back," he said, his voice a low and a very grim rumble. He wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam of the hatch, and with a grunt and a very powerful heave of his old and his very wiry body, he began to pry. The hidden hatch, the door to the nightmare, was about to be opened. The sound of the steel hatch breaking open was a loud and a very violent groan of a tortured and a very metal, a sound that echoed through the silent and the very empty plaza like a gunshot. Carl, with a final and a very powerful heave, threw the heavy and the very steel door open. A wave of a cold and a very musty air, the air of a place that had not been touched by the sun, or a fresh and a very clean breeze in a very long and a very dark time washed over them. They peered down into the darkness. A narrow and a very rusty iron ladder descended into a black and a very absolute void. The banging had stopped. The sudden and the very violent noise of their entry had been replaced by a new and a very heavy silence. A silence that was, in its own and a very strange way, more terrifying than the noise had been. "Kayla?" Denise's voice was a raw and a very desperate whisper that was swallowed by the darkness. There was no answer. Carl shone his powerful and his very industrial flashlight down into the hole. The beam cut through the darkness, and it revealed a small and a very cramped concrete tunnel, just tall enough for a man to stand in. The tunnel was filled with a thick and a very complex web of pipes and a very electrical conduits. "This is an old and a very forgotten maintenance corridor," Carl whispered, his voice a mixture of a professional and a very calm assessment, and a personal and a very deep awe. "It's not on the new and the very modern plans. It was built with the original and the very old park back in the 60s. Denise did not hesitate. She was a mother. Her child was down there. She swung her legs over the edge of the hatch, and she began to climb down the rusty and the very cold iron ladder. Carl, after a moment's and a very brief hesitation, followed her. They were in another world, a world that was directly and a very surreally beneath the happy and the very sunlit world of the amusement park. The air was cold, and it was damp, and it smelled of a wet and a very old earth and a rust and something else, a faint and a very cloying sweet smell, the smell of a fear. They moved slowly down the narrow and the very cramped tunnel, their only light the single and the very powerful beam of Carl's flashlight. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of their own, and a very ragged breathing and the drip, drip, drip of a water from a leaky and a very old pipe. They were in the park's secret and its very hidden belly, and they knew, getting closer to its dark and its very monstrous heart. The narrow and the very claustrophobic maintenance tunnel was a straight and a very direct path into the park's forgotten and its very secret heart. As they moved deeper into the darkness, the faint and the very sweet smell of a fear grew stronger. The air grew colder and the silence grew heavier, and then they began to see the signs. The first was a small and a very brightly colored plastic hair clip lying in the thick and the very gray dust on the concrete floor. It was a small and a very insignificant object, but in the context of this dark and this very forgotten place, it was a detail that was so profoundly and so horrifyingly out of place that it was a silent and a very powerful scream. Denise knelt down, and she picked it up, her own, and a very trembling hand, recognizing it instantly. It was Kayla's. The discovery was a double-edged and a very sharp sword. It was the absolute and the very definitive proof that her daughter had been here. It was a sign that she was on the right path, but it was also the confirmation of her deepest and her most terrible fears. This was not a story of a lost child. This was a story of a monster. They kept moving, their pace now faster, more urgent. The beam of Carl's flashlight danced across the walls of the tunnel, and it began to reveal a new and a very chilling kind of a detail, a graffiti. But it was not the typical and the very spray-painted tags of the urban artists. It was a series of a small and a very desperate scratches in the dusty and the very crumbling concrete of the walls. They were names. Names of a children. And next to the names were a series of a small and a very neat tally marks, a calendar of a stolen and a very long time. The tunnel opened up into a larger and a more cavernous space. It was a hidden and a very secret corridor, a place that was clearly and a very obviously a central and a very active hub. And at the far end of the corridor, there was a door, a heavy and a very steel door, with a small and a very barred window at the top. And from behind that door, they could now, and very clearly, hear the sound. It was not the sound of a banging. It was the sound of a soft and a very muffled crying. The sound of a children. The climax of their long and their very dark journey was now just a few, and a very short, feet away. They had found the secret and the very hidden prison. They had found the heart of the park's dark and its very monstrous secret. And they knew, with a certainty that was both a terrifying and a very triumphant thing, that on the other side of that door, they would find the children. The door was locked, a heavy and a very industrial deadbolt, a final and a very cruel barrier between them and the children. Carl, his own and a very weary face, a mask of a grim and a very determined resolve, took out his crowbar again. But as he was about to pry at the lock, Denise stopped him. "Wait," she whispered, her voice a raw and a very urgent thing. She pointed to the small and the very barred window at the top of the door. She stood on her toes and she peered through the window. The room on the other side was small, and it was dimly lit by a single and a very bare light bulb. And in that room, she saw them. A small and a very pathetic group of a half-dozen and a very terrified children, huddled together on a pile of a dirty and a very old mattresses, and among them her own, and a very small and a very, very brave face, was her daughter, Kayla. She was alive. The relief was a physical and a very powerful wave that almost and a very nearly brought Denise to her knees. But the relief was instantly and a very quickly followed by a new and a very cold wave of a terror. Because sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, his back to the door, was a man. He was not wearing a clown costume. He was just a man, a quiet and a very ordinary-looking man, who was watching the children with a calm and a very proprietary air. And then Kayla looked up, as if she could feel her mother's presence through the thick and the very steel door. And their eyes met. Denise put her finger to her lips, a silent and a very desperate signal. And Kayla, her own, and a very small and a very intelligent face, a mask of a pure and a very unadulterated terror, gave a small and an almost imperceptible nod. And then she whispered, her voice a tiny and a very brave and a very, very clear sound that carried through the small and the very barred window. The 5 and the very crucial words that would blow the entire and the very monstrous case wide open. "The clowns brought us here." Denise backed away from the door, her own, and a very frantic mind, a whirlwind of a terror, and a very clear and a very cold logic. She pulled out her cell phone, her own, and a very trembling fingers, fumbling with the buttons. She did not call the park security. She did not call the Houston police. She knew they would not believe her. She called the one, and the very last, number that she knew she could trust. She dialed 911. The call from the depths of the amusement park was a dispatch that was so bizarre, so unprecedented, that at first the 911 operator was convinced it was a prank. But there was a quality in Denise Carter's voice, a mixture of a pure and a very raw terror, and a chilling and a very absolute clarity that could not be faked. "My name is Denise Carter," she had said, her voice a low and a very urgent whisper. "My daughter, Kayla, disappeared from the Astroworld Park yesterday. I am in a tunnel under the park. I have found her. She is here, with other children, and there is a man with them. You have to send help, now." The response was a study in a controlled and a very escalating chaos. The discovery triggered a massive and a very city-wide tactical alert. The Houston Police Department, including a stunned and a very humbled Detective Riley, and the Harris County Sheriff's Department, and even the FBI, all descended on the park, their vehicles a silent and a very flashing sea of a blue and a very red light in the pre-dawn, and the very quiet darkness. The raid on the hidden and the very secret underground complex was a swift and a very silent operation. Guided by a frantic and a very determined Carl Simmons, a heavily armed and a very tactical SWAT team navigated the dark and the very treacherous tunnels. They breached the steel door, and they took the captor, a shocked and a very surprised Arthur Wynne, into custody without a fight. The man who had been the beloved and the very magical Mr. Patches was a quiet and a very pathetic figure in the harsh and the very unforgiving glare of the SWAT team's flashlights. The rescue of the children was a quiet and a very sacred event. They were brought out of the darkness, one by one, their pale and their very stunned faces a heartbreaking and a very triumphant testament to a mother's unshakable and a very unwavering faith. But the story did not end there. The tunnels, the investigators soon discovered, were not just a prison. They were a highway. They led through a series of a secret and a very unmapped exits to the city's storm drain system, which in turn connected to a series of a nondescript and a very anonymous warehouses on the outskirts of the city. The raids on those warehouses, which took place over the next and a very long 24 hours, revealed the true and the very horrifying scope of the network's operation. They found dozens more children, the forgotten and the very lost, victims of a silent and a very invisible war that had been raging and a very secretly in the city for years. The reunion between Denise and her daughter, Kayla, was a quiet and a very personal miracle in the midst of a very public and a very chaotic storm. They held each other, a mother and a daughter, a two-person universe that had been so brutally and so violently torn apart and was now, finally, and a very impossibly made whole again. The world was left to grapple with the horrifying and the very humbling truth. A place of a pure and a very innocent joy had been used as the perfect and the very monstrous camouflage for an unspeakable and a very unimaginable evil. And the one and the very single person who had seen the truth, the one who had been dismissed as a hysterical and a very paranoid mother, had been the one and the very single person who had brought the whole and the very dark and the very secret world crashing down. Her daughter had not just vanished in the noise. She had been found by a mother who had, against all odds, refused to stop listening.